Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Michael Kuhlman. I'm the Senior Associate for South Asia and also the Deputy Director of the Asia Program, all here at the Wilson Center. My name is not Abe Denmark, the Asia Program Director who is scheduled to provide welcoming comments. He unexpectedly had some dental surgery, so he's not in a position to do public speaking, so I'm going to step in. But we do appreciate you being here, Abe, and thank you for your support and help with this event. Thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. And before I forget, I wanted to thank the Middle East program of the Wilson Center, which is our institutional co-sponsor. Just a quick few words about the Wilson Center. We are chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We serve as the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. In the spirit of President Wilson, the only U.S. president to have held a PhD, we build a bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy to inform and develop solutions to the nation's problems and challenges. So this coming Saturday marks 16 years since the start of the current war in Afghanistan. As we so often hear, it is the longest foreign war in U.S. history. The combat mission may have officially ended at the end of 2014, but American soldiers remain there. 16 years is a long time, and if American troops are still there some more years down the road, we could face the sobering reality of some American soldiers going to fight in a war that began before they were born. It's a war that's had very heavy human costs, with well more than 30,000 Afghan civilians losing their lives. Nearly 2,500 American soldiers have been killed in the war. The outcomes of the war so far have been mixed. On the one hand, by some measures, the Taliban has never been stronger. Some estimate that it now controls more territory in Afghanistan than at any time since foreign troops entered the country 16 years ago. So there is a lot of bad news to talk about. But at the same time, I think even the biggest cynic would agree that Afghanistan is a better place now. It's in a better place now than it was before October 7th, 2001, whether you're talking about improvements in the war-fighting capacities of the Afghan security forces or the status of women in Afghanistan, just to name a few positive changes. Either way, this is a war that America will continue to be involved in. President Trump's new Afghanistan strategy has affirmed that the U.S. military commitment in Afghanistan will remain in place for an indefinite period. So given that we now have a new strategy and given that we're now marking the 16th anniversary of the war, we thought that this would be the right time to take stock of where things stand with the war in Afghanistan and the best ways forward. The Wilson Center has been quite active on Afghanistan in recent years, even when the country has and the war have receded from the headlines. We've hosted events on prospects for peace talks in Afghanistan. We've hosted events on Afghanistan's relations with Pakistan. We hosted a talk not too long ago by Afghanistan's health minister. We launched a new book on Afghan women leaders. We've hosted as fellows several prominent journalists, including Christina Lamb, The Times of London, Rajiv Chandrasekaran of The Washington Post, who have done book projects on Afghanistan. And we have a great panel of experts this morning who we've asked to weigh in. But before we get to the panel, we're going to have some opening remarks from Afghanistan's ambassador to the U.S., whom I'm sure many of you know. That would be, of course, His Excellency Dr. Hamdullah Mohib. He has been Afghanistan's envoy here since, I believe, 2015. Previously, he was Deputy Chief of Staff to the President of Afghanistan. Before joining the government, Ambassador Mohib worked for the American University of Afghanistan and the Intel Corporation, and he's also been a very active leader in civil society within the global Afghan community. He founded the largest Afghan diaspora youth association in Europe, the Afghan Students Association of the UK. He also founded and served as chairman of the board for the Afghan Professionals Network. So, Mr. Ambassador, I invite you up to the podium to give some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. It's great to be able to speak first before the panel speaks, so we don't have any questions to ask or changing any of the remarks. But I'm honored to be here today. It's a very important discussion and a very important time. We're gathered to talk about America's longest war. But I'm here to say that it's also Afghanistan's longest war. It's true that it's a global effort, and the US remains to be our fundamental partner in fighting this menace of terrorism. But Afghans are fighting on the front lines. The stakes are high for us. In the last 2 years alone, we took nearly 75,000 casualties, and the weight of the coffins is extremely heavy. The talk around Washington is about the future of this war. There are those who believe we must fight and talk to the Taliban at the same time. There are others who believe we must fight, then talk. Regardless of which camp you find yourself in, the common belief is that there is no military solution to the conflict in Afghanistan. If that is the case, then what is it that we must do differently to bring this war to a successful conclusion? Ladies and gentlemen, we must win the people. That has been the missing link. In 2008, during the Karzai administration, I asked villagers in the Khogyani district of Nangarhar province, not far from Tora Bora, where it all started, or why they don't report Taliban activity to the government. The answer was, why should they? They felt, though, that neither the government nor the Taliban provide any governance or protection. So their strategy for survival was to remain neutral and to not get involved. Over the years, I've heard similar sentiments across Afghanistan and even in the capital, Kabul. Though military victories have been swift and decisive over the last 40 years, we have failed to provide services and governance our people so desperately want and need. Since the new US strategy was announced, we've once again, in just over a month, put the Taliban on the defensive. Casualties rate has reversed. In the last 48 hours alone, 95 militants were killed, 19 more were arrested, and 3 landmine and IED factories were seized. The Afghan security forces are on the offensive in villages and districts across Afghanistan. But what the focus of President Ghani's administration has been from day one is not to solely win militarily and boost our security forces, but also create a system of governance that is citizen and service oriented. For too long, they have suffered human rights abuses, degradation, and injustices at the hands of warlords. Today, we're addressing the grievances of the people. Corruption, a direct product of warlord mentality and impunity, has posed a serious threat to our stability, where we are changing that both systematically and aggressively. Yesterday at the senior officials meeting in Kabul, we presented our progress report. At the top of the list were our counter-corruption efforts. I present a few highlights from that report here. The Attorney General's office has tried nearly 1,100 cases of corruption, including bribery, embezzlement, treachery, abuse of public authority, and forging documents. 468 people have been jailed, and repayments and fines totaling more than $14 million have been ordered. This is just in the last year. In prosecutions by the Anti-Corruption Justice Center, 31 individuals have been sentenced to prison for a combined total of 209 years behind bars, including 3 officials from the Ministry of Urban Development for corruption, 6 from the Ministry of Finance for taking bribes. A senior Ministry of Interior official was arrested for bribery. 8 senior officials, including a deputy Interior Minister, have been suspended, and 7 Ministry of Education officials were arrested in connection with a $191,000 US graft. $9 million has been recovered. The Ministry of Defense has also been on the forefront of the war against corruption. 1,400 staff members have been dismissed, Investigations are underway into 55 cases of illegal ammunition and weapon sales, in which 109 people were involved. 578 cases are being investigated for other crimes. Similarly, the National Procurement Authority has blacklisted 137 firms, approved 2,330 contracts with a total value of 300 billion AFs, and saving 18.3 billion AFs, which would have gone to the wrong pockets. Land grabbing is now a criminal offense. 15,831 land usurpers have been identified, and 64,000 hectares of illegally seized land has been reclaimed, and 355 illegal townships identified. Afghanistan moved up 4 points in the 2016 Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Ladies and gentlemen, regional politics are complex and must be addressed. But the fundamental ingredients of stability in Afghanistan are simple. Stability will not be secured at some distant negotiations table or foreign offices. It will be made at the homes of the Afghans. We need to address their grievances and commit resources to the reform efforts so we can draw this long war to conclusion. If we win the people, we will win both war and peace. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Ambassador Mohi. We appreciate the comments. We appreciate you making the time to share your thoughts. We're now going to go to the panel, which will offer U.S. perspectives on the war in Afghanistan and the strategy moving forward. It's a very distinguished panel of experts who have all three of them have served in senior roles, both either in U.S. government or in the military, in ways related to Afghanistan. And I should say before we go on, just a public service announcement. I meant to mention this earlier. We are live streaming this event. We're live tweeting it. We invite you to do so as well, using the hashtag 16YRS Afghanistan, and the wireless password is up on the walls on each side of the room. So with that out of the way, I just wanted to briefly introduce the speakers. You've got their bios in front of you, so I won't read them off, but very briefly, we're first going to hear from Lou Coffey. He's director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He's responsible for directing policy research for the Middle East, Africa, Russia, and the former Soviet Union, and the Western Hemisphere and the Arctic region. It's a pretty narrow portfolio. You may want to expand it a bit.
I'm not an expert, and I just direct the research.
From 2010 to 2012, which is of significant relevance here, he served as an advisor to the then British Defense Secretary Liam Fox, and among his tasks, among his duties, was to help shape British defense policy in relation to NATO and Afghanistan. Lou Coffey also was deployed in Afghanistan. He's a U.S. Army vet. He was there for a year and was awarded the Bronze Star. Next, we'll be hearing from Christopher Kalenda, who's an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. He recently served as the senior advisor on Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Department of Defense senior leadership. He has served 4 tours in Afghanistan. He has published several books, including he's the editor and co-author of Leadership, The Warrior's Art, and his new book is called The Counterinsurgency Challenge. And then third, we'll hear from Shamila Chaudhry, who is a senior advisor, or the senior advisor to Dean Vali Nasser at SAIS here in D.C. She's also a senior South Asia fellow at New America and a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute. She specializes in regional affairs in South Asia, including U.S.-Pakistan relations and Pakistan's domestic politics and security policy. She previously worked at the Eurasia Group, and she also has 12 years of experience in the U.S. government, most recently as director of Afghanistan and Pakistan at the National Security Council. So with that, Luke, we'll start with you. And you could stay seated or stand here, whatever you prefer.
I think I'll stay seated if that's okay. Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. And I want to thank Abe and the Wilson Center for inviting me to speak here today. Often when we get to the anniversary of 9/11, you hear people talking about their experiences of where they were when they heard about the attacks or when they first learned about the attacks. And but what I remember actually vividly was when I learned for the first time that we were entering Afghanistan. I was a senior in college. I was in the Missouri National Guard. I was at the Armory. We got the news. No one really knew what it meant. You know, this was a time when we were still wearing the old green camouflage uniform, and we would go to the shed and grab the Ivans, which were what we called the targets, which had the red star on their forehead, and then take them to the range and shoot at them. Still, it's kind of like an old Cold War type mentality still. And little did I know, if someone told me there on that Sunday, October 7th, 2001, that today, October 5th, 2017, I would be here talking about a President Donald Trump's strategy here at this great institution, the Wilson Center, I wouldn't have believed it 16 years later, but here we are. So President Trump's strategy on Afghanistan, I think I would describe in a pithy way in 3 words: responsible, reasonable, and realistic. I was slightly disappointed on how long it took because we were hearing all these rumors throughout the spring and early summer about the strategy, and we at the time didn't quite understand why it was taking so long. We have a better idea now. But I would say it's reasonable because it's still focusing on the training of the Afghan security forces, and it's not going back to the old ways of doing things, of leading combat operations with more than 140,000 U.S. and coalition troops. It's handling the security situation in a reasonable way. I would say it's responsible because we saw what happened in the 90s when we just completely left Afghanistan on its own, and we saw as recently as 2011 when we did the same thing in Iraq when we didn't leave a residual training force behind. And then I would describe it as realistic because I felt like we've started down the road of abandoning some of these more loftier goals that we had, and we're more focused on the security aspect in terms of U.S. goals. I thought there were 5 key takeaways from the strategy as it was announced by President Trump that night. The first one, I don't want to get too involved in the court politics of the White House, but McMaster defeated an insurgency inside the White House. There was the reason why, in my opinion, there was this delay is because there was this 2 competing camps on what the U.S. role should be in Afghanistan, and at the end of the day, Bannon is out and McMaster is in, and I felt like that had a lot to do with it. The second takeaway is that it's very important that we've decided to stay committed to this training mission, this training, advising, and assisting mission. Now, a lot of the criticism for this new strategy comes from an old-fashioned way of looking at Afghanistan, in my opinion. This isn't 2001. This isn't 2009 when President Obama announced his new strategy. At this time, the U.S. was leading combat operations. At the peak, we had 140,000 U.S. and coalition troops in the country. Today, it's a lot different. The Afghans are leading combat operations. President Obama deserves a lot of credit for really ramping up the training of the Afghan security forces. You know, at the height of the training program for the then ANSF, now the ANSDF, I think they threw a D in there recently for defense. At the height of this, we were spending about $12 billion a year, $1 billion a month, and we were spending $300 million alone in basic literacy training for the Afghans so the soldiers could read the serial numbers off their weapons and whatnot. And because of that big focus on training the Afghans, we are now to a place where we can sustain this and build onto it in a way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. The third takeaway, I liked President Trump's rhetoric, his shift away from the nation-building rhetoric that we heard over the years. I think this actually works well for not only what people describe as his base, but also for the American people at large. If you look at Afghanistan through the lens of nation-building and making it a free and democratic, non-corrupt, open society, then it's no wonder that Americans look at Afghanistan and they think everything we've done over the past 16 years has been a failure. Building schools, paving roads, strong central government, these are great things to aspire to, but they're neither the reasons why we went to Afghanistan nor the reasons why we should remain. And while these may be part of the campaign in Afghanistan, they're not the reason for the campaign in Afghanistan. So I think a slight change in rhetoric will help manage expectations of the American people, and you might find as a consequence more support for the campaign and the war, which in the end will help Afghanistan create the security space where they can improve on these non-security areas. The fourth point, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because Shamila is going to talk about this, but the regional approach was welcome, of course. When this was trailed before the speech, I was thinking it was really going to be a regional approach. Instead, it was like a South Asia approach. Central Asia wasn't mentioned at all. I went to an off-the-record briefing with 4 senior administration officials the following morning, and they gave their spiel for about 10 minutes each on the new strategy, and they never once mentioned Central Asia. And I just think we're really missing a trick here if we have a regional approach and arguably half of the region isn't included in it. And then fifth, perhaps the aspect of the speech that I disliked the most was this predictable Trumpian rhetoric of winning and victory, and this is too black and white. Afghanistan is a place with many shades of gray. It's not victory or defeat. It's not winning or losing. There's a huge space in the middle, and it's likely that's where we're going to end up at the end of this. So, can President Trump's strategy work? I think if the right goals define, it can work. The goal in Afghanistan, in my opinion, should be to create a country and an Afghan security force that is strong enough and capable enough to manage its own internal security without the help of tens of thousands of foreign troops, so Afghanistan never becomes a safe haven for terrorists again. Nothing more, nothing less. That's how Americans should define success. And in that context of security, I think the mission in Afghanistan can be successful. I also think that the White House and the U.S. government and perhaps the Congress need to do more to inject a bit of realism in what we're going to achieve someday in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's not going to be a perfect country. No country's perfect. We shouldn't have unrealistic expectations. There will always be an insurgency in my lifetime in Afghanistan, in my opinion. This is my assessment. This isn't defeat. This is reality. India, the world's largest democracy, fights 2 insurgencies inside its borders. The United Kingdom, until the mid-90s, was fighting an Irish Republican insurgency in Northern Ireland. Sometimes this is just the way it is. And until we can get to that negotiated political settlement, there will remain an insurgency in certain parts of the country. And on that political settlement, I think President Trump mentioning this in his speech was welcome, and I would like to hear more information from the administration on where they're going to take this idea. As the ambassador pointed out, there is no military solution to this problem. You can no more kill your way out of an insurgency than you can drink yourself out of alcoholism. And the goal of any counterinsurgency is to create the conditions where those who have legitimate political grievances can express and air these grievances through a political process and not through violence. So this will end in talks. They have to be Afghan-led in Afghanistan, and we should support this. I know this makes many Americans feel uncomfortable, especially this idea of talking to the Taliban and everything, but this is the reality. And if we don't want to have a negotiated settlement to this conflict, then we're not fighting a counterinsurgency. We might be fighting something else, but it's not a counterinsurgency, and I think we need to be realistic about this. And finally, I would argue, with all the doom and gloom out there about Afghanistan, it's not all that bad on the security front. When I was doing a lot of TV interviews and talks leading up to the announcement of the strategy, I kept hearing this figure that 50% of Afghanistan is controlled by the Taliban. And people kept repeating this, and it's simply not true. The Taliban that rolled into Kandahar in the mid-90s is nothing like the Taliban being faced today. And if you look at the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, SIGAR, if you look at their quarterly report, and I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with SIGAR, and they're not known for their optimistic take or spin on what's happening in Afghanistan. In their latest quarterly report, they say out of Afghanistan's 407 districts, the Taliban control 11, which is 2.7% of the total number of districts. And the Taliban has full control over 9% of Afghanistan's population. The government of Afghanistan has full control over 66%, and the remainder, roughly 25% or so, remains contested. So in terms of security, the campaign can be successful, but it's not going to be, a clear-cut victory. It's going to be complex the way it ends, and it's probably going to just, and my prediction is it's going to someday, we're going to reach the point where U.S. troops are out, Afghan forces are capable, and the political process is in full swing. And by this point, most Americans probably will not be focused or concerned about the issue in Afghanistan one way or the other. I'm going to close with a quote from Winston Churchill, but not as Prime Minister or senior government official, but by Lieutenant Winston Churchill from 1897, 110 years ago, when he was fighting the Pashtuns along what is now the Afghan-Pakistan border. He said about the type of warfare he faced then and the type of warfare we face now, quote, "There are no general actions on a great scale, there are no brilliant successes, no important surrenders, and no chance for a coup d'etat. It is just a rough, hard job which must be carried through. The war is one of small incidents. The victory must be looked for in the results." And I would say what applied in 1897 applies today in 2017. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. And you're right, that does seem to be a pretty apt quote for the present circumstances. Chris, we'll go to you.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And thanks, Abe, Michael, and the Wilson Center for inviting me to speak here. Luke, thanks for great comments. And Shamila, it's great to be here on the panel with you. We spent a lot of time noodling on Afghanistan policy for many years, so that's it's tremendous being here. And Ambassador, thank you so much for your very candid and very superb comments on Afghanistan and the way forward. I also want to thank President Trump for deciding not to withdraw from Afghanistan or to send in mercenaries. And I think anybody who spent time in Afghanistan, I've spent about 4 of the last 10 years on the ground in the country. Anybody who has spent time with Afghans, anybody who has gotten to know the ambassador, has gotten to know President Ghani, can't help but want what is absolutely best for this country, for Afghanistan. Can't help but want Afghanistan to succeed. Has anybody here seen and the question is, what's the right path to get there? And I'm not quite sure we've got that yet. So how many have seen the Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam? A few? All right, probably a few more than hands went up. I found it absolutely fascinating, where you see some themes repeating itself. And I don't mean the sort of the goofy themes about, war's unwinnable, why are we there, why are we not? I mean some of the themes like military-centric strategies that we have had in Vietnam, we've had in Iraq, we've had in Afghanistan. Claims of progress that have never added up to strategic success, major issues with host nation governance and corruption, major issues with U.S. government silos, a lack of clear strategy, and ineffective execution on the ground. In both cases, in both Vietnam and Iraq, and when you look at the longitudinal studies on counterinsurgency, you've got, when a host nation government has challenges, is unable to win the battle of legitimacy in insurgent-controlled and contested areas, it tends to be unsuccessful. And it's happened every time since the Second World War. It's unable to win a decisive victory. When an insurgency has durable internal support within the country, and external support and sanctuary, it tends to be successful every single time. And it's been like this every single time in every single insurgency since the Second World War, and probably longer before that. In Afghanistan, we've got both problems. And the question is, will the same approaches to this conflict yield different results? The Trump administration, President Trump outlined a new strategy, which Luke has very well articulated. And quite frankly, it's time to develop an actual strategy to win. And by winning, for the United States, I mean achieving our war aims. Now, the Trump administration has laid out what is basically the same formula as laid out by the Obama administration and the Bush administration before it. Add more troops, plus build Afghan capacity and get tough on corruption, plus put more pressure on Pakistan, will lead to the Taliban to capitulate or to come, suing for peace. And we've added a conditions base, which the Bush administration also said was conditions based, but yet neither administration has defined what those conditions are, nor examined whether they are achievable. So the question is, will the same basic theory of success that we have been trying for 16 years yield this time to different results? The president's made the right decision to stay in Afghanistan, and now his National Security Council needs to do the right thing and give the president meaningful options to achieve a successful outcome, to win. Unfortunately, the United States continues, or the government continues to offer the president military-centric strategies for what the ambassador said is a conflict that has no military solution. So what sense does this make? Have a military-focused strategy for a war that has no military solution. We need to start thinking differently about how we deal with these issues. I had the good fortune of studying recently at King's College and completing a doctoral dissertation on how wars end, and look specifically at insurgencies. And the bottom line is, there are three ways that wars end successfully. They can end in a decisive victory, which either can mean surrender of your adversary, or they essentially sue for peace. Second, they can end successfully in a negotiated outcome. And certainly somebody who's written a book called The Art of the Deal understands that a negotiated outcome that meets your interests is a win. And third, it can end, if you're an intervening power, it can end when you build the capacity of the host nation, and then that host nation then is able to continue the war to a successful conclusion that meets American interests. Each one of those general ways that wars end prioritize different elements of national power. The strategies look different for each. A decisive victory strategy essentially has a military-centric approach. The military aim, or the military element of national power, is the priority, with everything else supporting it, because you're looking for either the enemy to surrender, to capitulate, or to cease to exist. A negotiated outcome, on the other hand, will place priority on a diplomatic element of national power, with the aim of using military and intelligence and economic and other elements to support the achievement of a negotiated outcome that meets your interests. A strategy that aims for a transition, successful transition, like we tried to do under the Obama administration, should have host nation politics and developing host nation legitimacy, or supporting that, as the top priority. And so that means you're dealing with issues like corruption. That means that you're dealing with issues such as leadership, et cetera, both within, and good governance, both within the government as well as within the host nation security forces. So it's possible for the National Security Council to develop those three options for success, evaluate them for the president, and then have a discussion and actually choose which of those three is most likely to lead to a successful outcome. That's how you develop options for this kind of conflict, for an insurgency, and a way to get away from the military-centric high, medium, low approach, or in the case of this current decision-making process, a strategy that guaranteed we continue doing more of the same versus two strategies that guaranteed losing. One leaving, and then one sending in mercenaries. In terms of implementing whatever the president decides between those three options, we need to do a few things on implementation, such as actually put somebody in charge of U.S. government efforts on the ground. Right now, if you were to ask who is actually in charge of American efforts on the ground in Afghanistan, there is nobody. The military does its own thing. The State Department, the embassy does its own thing. USA does its own thing. The intelligence community does its own thing, etc. And the whole is less than the sum of its parts. There's no way to get effective integration or prioritization until you have somebody that can focus on this conflict 24/7. And the National Security Council in Washington, D.C. simply doesn't have the bandwidth for it. We also need to think differently about conditionality. We have tried so often to say we're going to get tough on corruption by conditioning aid. Well, when you condition aid, it's essentially you're cutting off your nose to spite your face, because the government needs the aid. The government tends to want to make the policy changes that result in positive outcomes, but oftentimes are prevented by very powerful forces and actors within the country from doing it. And so if you cut off the aid, you undermine the government, and so you never wind up cutting off the aid. A better approach to conditionality is to apply conditionality on individuals who are spoiling or blocking progress on political reform. As we do all of this and think about which option is best, there are 7 major challenges that we have to think about, and I'll hit them just very briefly. First of all, as the ambassador noted, Afghanistan have been at war for 40 years. It's an extraordinary amount of time and deep, deep scar tissue. Anybody who says, let's just get everybody around a negotiating table and crack a deal, is not respecting Afghans and not respecting that very difficult history of 40 years. Second major challenge is the warlords and the kleptocratic system that grew up under the Karzai administration. People have an economic interest in sustaining corruption and sustaining the conflict. That needs to be addressed. Of course, international sanctuary and local support for the Taliban remains a challenge, as does the Taliban sort of strategic fragmentation. The Taliban lack a coherent or a consensus approach on a way forward. And so when you lack a coherent and consensus approach, they tend to default to the status quo. The idea that the Taliban today is going to be fighting and tomorrow is going to be suing for peace is just simply unrealistic, because that's not how the Taliban make decisions, and they're too fragmented to be able to make those big changes. It's going to be a gradual shift over time. The same way with the Afghan government. Very divided against itself, very fragmented. They are not going to be able to make major changes overnight. It's going to have to be gradual over time. We definitely need to overcome U.S. government silos, and as Shamila will talk about, regional actors remain a challenge. The bottom line for the last 16 years is success. A successful outcome to the war in Afghanistan, or success in Afghanistan, has been no one's top priority. And it's time for that to change. And the Trump administration has a unique opportunity right now, early in its administration, to develop a proper strategy to bring this war to a successful conclusion, and a successful conclusion that meets U.S. national interests. And the question now is, will the administration have both the political courage to develop 3 options and examine them, and have the bandwidth to create a proper strategy going forward that respects the services and sacrifices of Afghans and Americans alike. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that very useful, very sobering set of comments. So, Shamila, we go to you.
Thank you. I see my colleagues have left the easy stuff for me. I, Pakistan is one of the hardest foreign policy issues many of us have ever worked on. I think we can be very honest about that. And I would wager that for the Pakistanis that worked with the Americans over the past decade, they would probably argue the same thing, that this has been one of the most challenging kind of predicaments that the relationship has endured. I'm so happy to be outside of government. I don't have to answer. I don't have to offer any solutions. I can just give you my analysis. So I admire and envy the ambassador and others who are continuing to serve. We need our best people serving, so just don't forget that. Before I go into kind of why we're here today and the role of regional actors, I just want to share the biggest thing I learned from my time in government working on these issues. And that is that any kind of policy that you want to see a result in requires trade-offs. Nothing is perfect. You've heard us say that already, but it requires some trade-offs. It requires balancing out certain priorities against more urgent issues. And if you can cement that in your mind, I think we can find a way to move forward without making everyone happy, of course, but finding some place where we can get Afghanistan to where it needs to be, where it doesn't need a foreign government helping it kind of maintain its presence in Kabul against its rivals. So I think we have to keep in mind that issue of trade-offs. So how did we get here? I'm going to answer that question from the perspective of U.S.-Pakistan relations. I saw kind of a very clear evolution of the enemy since 9/11 began up until where we are today. And I'll just say my whole career has been defined by working post 9/11. I was in graduate school when it happened, and every job I've had has been on national security. And when 9/11 happened, there was a very clear enemy. There was a very clear threat to U.S. national security. A foreign terrorist organization, al-Qaeda, was threatening the United States, and the Afghan government was giving it shelter. So clear targets and clear kind of political and ideological aims were very apparent to the United States government, although we didn't have a lot of knowledge about the inner workings of the al-Qaeda and its relationship with the Taliban. But it was a simpler time, ironically. And then as the war evolved, the conflict brought in more characters, if you will. And it included friends of our enemies. And in the case of Pakistan, the tribal groups on the Af-Pak border organized themselves in a very opportunistic way to get involved in Afghanistan and also to attack the Pakistani state for its cooperation with the United States. Okay, so if we're considering the regional angle of the continuation of the war, I think we have to go back to this moment in time. It was this particular domestic dynamic in Pakistan, the tribal opposition to Islamabad's role in Afghanistan complicated the whole U.S. effort, given the bilateral relationship that the U.S. had with Pakistan. And the focal point of the war changed for the United States. If not publicly, definitely privately. I remember going to briefings in Islamabad where our office of the defense representative would be giving us briefings on TTP more than briefings on al-Qaeda and the folks we were supposed to be fighting, as we thought. And so this internal threat, as this internal threat grew, the concerns of the United States were still in Afghanistan, but then they also were part of this kind of broader bilateral relationship and set of interests that Americans have had in Pakistan for a long time, which have to do with the stability of the government, the fact that the country has nuclear weapons, and now there are all these tribal groups that are wanting to essentially kind of dislodge the government in Islamabad. That's a big concern for the United States. And so I saw over time the strategy for the war constantly coming into conflict with, for lack of a better word, the strategy for the bilateral relationship. So put that context in your mind, and then the arrival of groups like LET and other anti-India groups into the Afghanistan theater of war, and how that really made things infinitely more complicated for every country in the region, pulling in India, pulling in Afghanistan, Pakistan in completely different ways. And it didn't help that Pakistan's strategy towards those groups really hadn't changed, and in fact was becoming even more solidified as it saw how the United States was really not willing to kind of make certain concessions to the Pakistanis. And now, in recent years, we've seen that ISIS-affiliated fighters, whether they're proper ISIS or just inspired by ISIS, are taking root in the region. Meanwhile, the Afghan Taliban is still, for the most part, the leadership is in Quetta, Pakistan, and who are we targeting, I guess, is the question that I'm left with. If we are to end the war today, who exactly do we end it with? Al-Qaeda, Afghan Taliban, ISIS, TTP, LET, or Islamabad? I didn't hear that in President Trump's strategy speech. I didn't hear who the enemy was exactly, just that he was going to crush the enemy. And I think the American people deserve more than that. So in kind of summary, the proliferation of the security threats, plus the fact that Pakistan's national security calculus in Afghanistan remains consistent, and I would argue it has never changed despite carrots and incentives by the U.S. The pull for American involvement in Afghanistan remains there. We as Americans, and as a former policymaker, I would say yes, I think we should stay there, because not just because of U.S. national security, but because of a collapse in Kabul and what that could mean for the region and for the Afghan people, because of the increased likelihood of India-Pakistan confrontation, and then the growing presence of non-state actors and the strength of those individuals to challenge governments and cause chaos is apparent. We see it in the news every day. So all of this I see as having boxed the United States in to slowing down or having a much more limited set of options for withdrawal. So in general, I'm comfortable with the strategy that the Trump administration has put together. And if you read it, there's a lot of consistency with Obama and Bush, in that there's a focus on eliminating safe havens, and there's a focus on making sure nuclear material doesn't get into the hands of terrorists and being used against the United States. That's a bipartisan policy right there. I also agree that we shouldn't be announcing timetables, and it really didn't work for us in the Obama administration, because we were also trying to socialize and run a reconciliation process while we were saying we were leaving. And I think it's Military Strategy 101 says, don't ever tell your enemy where you're going or when you're going. So I'm glad that there was a course correction there. However, refusing to announce a timetable does not make policy. That's not a policy unto itself. And so the best policy moving forward is one that the Trump administration is talking about, but I think they need to amplify it a little bit more, and that is simply to return Afghanistan to a self-functioning state that doesn't need foreign assistance to prop itself up. And I think everyone is on the same page with that. That's reassuring. But a military strategy isn't going to get us there, especially because we've been at this for so many years. And as Chris said, there's just a lot of scar tissue. Perhaps in the beginning it might have worked, but I really think it's unrealistic to think now we can win militarily. And so my consistent view on this has always been that we have to have a policy that is centered on a political settlement. That is the policy, that the end of this is how the war ends. That is how wars end, is through settlement. And all aspects of that policy should be designed to facilitate that. So whatever development assistance we give to Afghanistan, whatever military support, et cetera, that's all to kind of achieve this particular end. I couldn't answer the question, what is our goal in Afghanistan? As you know, United States, what is our goal? I can't answer that question for you because that hasn't been clarified. And last I checked, I think the Taliban are still looking for some kind of political role at the provincial level or at the national level. So that has to be, I mean, if that's who you're fighting and that's what they want, that's something that has to be on the table. But I don't think it is something that happens on the timeline of the United States. That's something that is for the Afghan people to decide and the Afghan government to lead. And I'm definitely not advocating that the Taliban are the right leaders for the country either. In fact, they were one of the most brutal regimes in kind of the world, and we don't want that to return. So, but rather I'm suggesting we look at this strictly kind of from a intellectual angle, that we keep in mind that this is how the conflict started with these stakeholders, and to end it, you need to acknowledge that these stakeholders continue to have interests, and good foreign policy and its outcomes require that we acknowledge that. And that's the best way to support a sustainable Afghan government. And then finally, just on the regional side, more specifically to Pakistan and other countries, I think the policy as stated by the Trump administration contradicts itself with its focus on India and asking India to do more in Afghanistan beyond its already very kind of active and generous development engagement. You simply can't get Pakistan to kind of come to the table or cooperate more with the United States by pursuing this approach. I mean, that's in fact what has gotten Pakistan to be more aggressive in kind of courting various militant groups and others. But I do think it served a good purpose in that it made it very clear to the region that the India relationship remains a priority for the United States. Privately, I think it's going to be a lot harder to enforce that. It already, it has been for a long time, and that's because of that same dynamic I explained that before the war in Afghanistan, the U.S. had a series or a set of bilateral relationships with these countries, India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And then once the war started, all of those became essentially second fiddle to that war kind of strategy. And we've never been able as policymakers to reconcile the discrepancies in those approaches. And it's because they're very hard. And we're not always willing to accept the trade-offs associated with that. And that's why you see us in this relationship with the Pakistanis right now, is it's hot and cold because we have a lot of competing interests. And also, the Pakistanis have been really capable at effectively managing U.S. pressure while maintaining their own policies. So let that be a lesson to us moving forward, that there's no such thing as carrots and sticks when it comes to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. So we're going to have to just change the way we think about this country. This is not a client state of the United States. We can't control it. We don't have that perception with any country that we work on. Why do we have it with Pakistan? It's an independent, sovereign country. It's going to pursue its own interests. Where we agree with them, we should pursue it. Where we don't, we should acknowledge that and kind of deal with it as we see fit as Americans. So things to be worried about moving forward. I think that the Pakistanis obviously are going to hunker down on their engagement with stakeholders that they believe serve their interests in the region. So not just non-state actors, as we all know, but China, Russia, Iran, anyone really seeking to balance U.S. hegemony. I think we have to kind of think about it in this larger kind of ideological realm. It's hard for Americans to remember that because we're so isolated from the rest of the world, but all of these countries are sitting on top of each other, and then they see us there, and we don't really belong there. So remember that they're always working with each other regardless of whether they agree or disagree on certain issues. They have to. So I would look for more potential standoffs in Kashmir and on other disputed issues between India and Pakistan. I think that's something to be wary of. And then on the Russia point, we've seen reports of Russia reaching out to the Taliban and developing those relationships. And I think there's definitely an opportunity for Russia to become more involved in ways that make it harder for the United States to stabilize the region. It's already kind of started to behave like Pakistan by choosing sides. And it's kind of a back to the future moment, but on steroids, I think, with Russia and the U.S. in this global competition in Eastern Europe and then in the Middle East and even at home in America. And so, ironically, Afghanistan could become kind of another kind of satellite for U.S.-Russia antagonism in a way to influence these other global conflicts. So I think that's important to look at it from that perspective as well. That's it.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, thank you, Shamila, and thank you to the three of you. Some really interesting set of comments, which I think has set the stage for some discussion. I'm just going to put a few questions on the table to the panel, and you don't all have to respond to all of them. You could pick and choose, but I'll put a few questions on the table that I hope will allow us to build on what we've been discussing over the last hour. First of all, I think we all agree there's consensus here that there are no military solutions in Afghanistan. The war cannot end militarily. So, have you examined this issue of reconciliation and political solutions one more time? And we know, and we've discussed, that the Taliban is a divided organization. It's not right to talk about the Taliban. It's really the Talibans. There are a lot of different factions of them. We know that if we want to think about the possibility of some type of negotiated outcome to the war, it's going to take a lot of time. But the question I would pose is, what incentives would need to be there for those factions of the Taliban that make the calls on whether they're going to come to the table to start discussing the notion of peace and reconciliation with Kabul? That's one question. Second question, I guess, would pick up on what you had been talking about before, Shamila. When we talk about regional context, regional spoilers, we talked a lot about Pakistan, talked a little bit about Russia, but I'd be curious to hear a bit more about the role of Iran in Afghanistan. It's an interesting case. I mean, as we know, Iran has actually cooperated with the United States in Afghanistan on several levels over the years, and yet there have been some pretty well-documented reports of Iranian arms shipments going to the Taliban. And of course, the U.S.-Iran relationship is in pretty bad shape now relative to how it was when the Obama administration was in power and came out with that nuclear accord. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about how we should look at the position of Iran. And finally, to be provocative, again, I think there's consensus on the panel that it was the right thing for the U.S. president, to keep U.S. forces in Afghanistan. My question is, what would you tell the average tax-paying private American citizen why we should be doing that, why we should keep forces, why we should continue to have this military presence in Afghanistan? We've all heard the numbers about how much it's cost. We know about all of the lost lives. Is it really the security factor? Is it the concern about what could happen if there were to be a pullout, if you could have the sanctuaries reconstituting itself? Is that what it comes down to, or are there other things that we should be thinking about as well? So briefly, those are the questions. I guess maybe we could start with Luke, if you're ready.
Okay. On the first one, I mean, really, this has to be an issue for the Afghans in terms of what they feel comfortable bringing to the negotiating table. And I think the U.S. just has to be there supporting both sides, or not supporting both sides, encouraging both sides, or all sides for that matter, to do this. But as Chris pointed out, this isn't going to happen overnight. This will be a process and not an event. And it's likely to be a very long time before this happens. But it's inevitable that if this conflict is to draw to some sort of a close, this is going to have to happen. On the second point about Iran, I think Iran's very pragmatic when it comes to Afghanistan. Traditionally it supported the Shia Hazaras in Afghanistan, but it's shown a willingness, we now know, to support other groups if it helps to kill Americans or Brits or other coalition troops. And they're willing to have that trade-off of providing support to groups that historically they otherwise would not have done so. But we should not think that this is something new for Iran. I mean, in 1838, with the help of Russia, they laid siege to Herat, trying to capture a great city that they thought, historically and culturally should be part of the Persian Empire. They've been involved in Western Afghanistan culturally, economically, for a very long time. And as was pointed out by Shamila, it's important that we as Americans understand that these countries all have to live together. And while we might have serious issues with Iran when it comes to its nuclear program or some of its nefarious activities in the region, we should encourage all of the countries in the region to work together and find a way to get along, and that includes Afghanistan and Iran. And on the final point, this is always difficult, because if you focus specifically on one issue and how much it costs to the average American taxpayer, there's a huge fiscal libertarian streak in me as well, and of course I question it too. I think as a nation we have to decide if the investment we're making in Afghanistan is worth the benefits we receive, and I think we have to stop looking at Afghanistan merely as a continuing war. We're not leading combat operations anymore, although the U.S. troops that are there are definitely involved in combat. But we should start perhaps looking at Afghanistan as one of the dozens of training missions we have around the world to train the Afghan security forces. We train the militaries of various countries all around the world to help achieve stability and security and to help achieve U.S. objectives. So I think that's one way to perhaps look at it. And, at the height of the war, we were spending $10 billion a month, $120 billion a year. And now, according to the latest OCO funding figures, it's about 20 or so billion, although I can't get a precise answer from anyone on how much we're actually spending in Afghanistan for the Resolute Support Mission and the counterterrorism mission. But, if you think about it, that's like what the U.S. was spending about every 20 days or so during the war, so during the height of the war. So as long as we, can create an Afghanistan that's stable and able enough to manage its own security so it doesn't become a launch pad for international terrorist attacks, then I would say the what is, relatively speaking, a modest investment is well worth it.
Chris?
As a taxpayer, I am utterly outraged at the lack of a coherent strategy for the conflict in Afghanistan. We are spending $25 billion a year, roughly, in this conflict. $25 billion a year can pay the salaries of 50,000 teachers in America for 10 years. $25 billion a year can refurbish 50,000 miles of dilapidated American roads. $25 billion can build the wall that the president wants to erect.
I don't know. I think it's going to be more than that.
Or at least those are the projections. So look, as a taxpayer, I'm outraged. We should not allow wars just to go on like a self-licking ice cream cone just because we don't have, there's not that many American deaths every year. There's not that many people, coming home with wounds seen and unseen every year. It's no big deal. And I know that's not what Luke is saying. I'm emphasizing the point that we need to do a much better job of holding our administrations accountable for developing coherent strategies that lead to successful outcomes in these conflicts. And our track record has not been very good. And we really need to rethink how we approach these conflicts. And we mentioned American suffering. Lest we forget the suffering of Afghan civilians, who are the ones that are really paying the price for this ongoing war. In terms of what does a political solution look like, it's a great question. Right now, the idea, or traditionally the idea of we're going to fight and talk, or we're going to fight then talk, generally means we're going to fight until the other side sues for peace. And I mean, just given the nature of the conflict, in terms of the challenges of the Afghan government in insurgent-controlled and contested areas, in terms of the fact that you've got an insurgency that has got enough local support to continue fielding a team, and international support that enables them to resource that team. The idea that the Taliban anytime soon, in the foreseeable future, is just simply going to sue for peace is probably unrealistic. Now maybe something strange will happen, but when you just look at it empirically and you look at it historically, it's unlikely. So the alternative, so that would be the military-centric approach. The diplomatic-centric approach would look at the conflict and how do we develop process that eventually leads to a peaceful outcome that advances our interests and respects the services and sacrifices of Afghans and Americans alike. I mean, this conflict is raging on 4 different levels: an international level, an Afghan-Pakistan level, a national level, and a local level. And any peace process at least has to deal with the top 3, but the most, naturally the most important is going to be dealing with the last one as well. And Michael, you asked about incentives for the Taliban. Well, there's challenges with all the actors on all the different levels. So when you look at the international level, Pakistan and India both see Afghanistan through the lens of their rivalry with one another. Iran sees Afghanistan primarily through the lens of its rivalry with Saudi Arabia, and vice versa. Russia sees Afghanistan through its rivalry with the United States. And this makes regional consensus on peace in Afghanistan incredibly challenging. Between Afghanistan and Pakistan, you likewise have a very complex history. You have very difficult challenges. Pakistan believes that India is going to use Afghanistan as a platform to dismantle the Pakistani state. Afghans are convinced that Pakistan is guiding the insurgency to overthrow the government. These are not things that you simply solve, by letting things run on autopilot. And then you've got the issue of the government and the Taliban. Both sides very fragmented. Both sides have elements within them that just want to see the war continue because they are getting filthy rich. You have elements on both sides that say, look, we need a peace process. But it's really hard to get there from here. And then you've got a lot of people in the middle. I was the Secretary of Defense's representative in these exploratory talks that we had with the Taliban, from 2010 to 2012, and you get a sense of the challenges in those conversations. But on the Afghan government Taliban level, there's going to have to be a point at which both sides recognize that, look, we're not going to win an outright victory. We've probably gained as much territory and influence as we're going to get. But even when you have that recognition of a stalemate, if there's not an alternative way out of the conflict, then the status quo prevails. People keep fighting, and this has played out historically. So you actually probably, in this case, with the complexity of this conflict, need a third-party facilitator that can, not an arbitrator, not a third party who's going to decide what the outcome is, but somebody who can create the architecture of a peace process so you can have these conversations at an international Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Afghan national conversations that are going to have to follow a very gradual path of confidence-building measures, then dialogue about reducing hostilities, and then finally, after several years of this, probably some discussion about what a political settlement might look like.
Thank you.
So, just to answer the question on the American taxpayer, I hate to say this, I don't think a lot of Americans care how much money has been spent in Afghanistan. We care. We care because we know, I wish I didn't know how much was spent and what has transpired. But there seems to be some kind of desensitization amongst Americans on kind of the when an American dies overseas. And it used to be that I remember visiting Pakistan once, and somebody joked to me and said, "Oh, people die here all the time. You Americans, like when one American dies, you go crazy." And it used to be true that an American death overseas used to mean something, and now it's become so normal to hear in some ways, and that the continuation of this war has really just pushed it into the background. And part of that, I think, is facilitated by the nature of our media right now. When I was a kid in the 80s, I watched the nightly news every night, and I learned about the war in Afghanistan. Every night, my dad watched that news, and I saw the tanks, I saw the troops, I saw Dan Rather. That stayed with me, and when 9/11 happened, I remembered that, and that gave me kind of a motivation to get involved into these issues. But now you don't see that. No one's seeing the same thing every day or reading the same reporting every day, and I do think that that has made it harder for us to unify around a sense of mission and purpose, both in the United States and then internationally. And so the question really is not, is this a waste of our money or a good use of our money, but what is America's role in the world? What purpose do we serve in helping and working with other countries to create a safer place for them to live? Is that our responsibility, or should we just let them do it themselves? Should we essentially abandon them when we've already been in the fight, in this case of Afghanistan? And the irony is that it runs counter to what President Trump actually wants to do, and it runs counter to his Make America Great Again philosophy, which is remove yourself from these foreign interventions because Americans at home need help, which I agree with. So his own Afghan policy doesn't really ring true to his political mission, but I think there's a lot of confusion there, and so Americans may not even know how to start to think about these issues.
No, that's a very fair point. I appreciate that's very true and also quite sobering. So we're going to go to questions from you all, and I think to try to maximize how many we can take, we'll take some questions together and then go back to the panel. So please keep your question to one question and wait until there's a microphone in front of you before we start. So let's start on this side of the room. So first question, I'll go to the gentleman with that, with the, I think that's a blue vest on right there. Yes, you, sir. Go no, we'll come to you next. Yeah.
Yeah, Phil Schrafer, international healthcare worker, 3 years in the U.S. Marine Corps. Colonel Basovich and Wesley Clark are my favorite guys. Quick comment. I go to the United States Institute of Peace. They've done a series of surveys on the Afghan people, and the ambassador is absolutely right. The Afghan people are unemployed, worried about crime, don't trust the police, and all the things he addressed were right on target to meet their needs. What I've heard at USIP also is that there have been a series of meetings. This was also testified to by the Pakistani ambassador to Washington, that there have been a series of meetings. Russia, China, Pakistan have had meetings in Moscow starting end of last year around negotiating with the Taliban, and that they even invited the United States, and the United States said no. So this is just a question to you all. Have you heard about this, and could you comment on it?
Okay, and let's go up here, right in front of you, Atif, the gentleman right in front of you. Yep. You, yeah.
Thank you very much, Michael. My name is Dabeer Tirmizi. My question is for Shumaila and to the other Luke and Chris. When Chris said that you need a facilitator, at least for doing this peace process in the region, in last month on the CNN, one of the opposition leader in Pakistan, named Imran Khan, he actually presented this idea to the American people that in order to bringing all the regional players and actors on the table, as you said, the national, international, and the locals, and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. So all of these actors, bringing them down to the table, he presented his services for this due to his credibility, that he's known among all these Quetta Shuras and Haqqani Network and all that. So what is your take on that kind of services offered to the American people?
And let's go to the gentleman right here. Yes. There we go.
Thank you. My name is Shakib Dost, and I'm from the Voice of America. Actually, Ambassador Muhib put a very unique discussion, which is a bit new for me, as winning the people. He stressed that if we win the people, we will win the war and peace. However, if you consider the Trump new strategy, it stresses much more on war. And when there's war, winning the people is very difficult, and the peace, achieving the peace is becoming very much complicated. So my question refers both to the panel, how we could win the people, however we stress on a military solution. And I don't know if Ambassador Mohib would also comment on this, how he thinks about this question. Thank you.
Let's take one more question, then we can go to the panels, if you don't have enough to think about already. There's a question toward, yes, you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Ziasi, and I come from Afghanistan. I absolutely agree with Ambassador Mohib, but I have a question for the panel. How to win over Pakistan? Some days back, you had Secretary, I think one of the senators asked Secretary Mattis that if Pakistan weren't supporting terrorists, would Afghanistan's problem be resolved? His answer was that not only Afghanistan's, but the entire South Asia's. So how can you win over Pakistan, and how can you and should you engage with Pakistan? I think that is the key here. Thank you.
All right, let's go back to the panel. Anyone want to take the first crack? Luke? You wanna?
Yeah, on Russia, I wouldn't get too excited about Putin's attempts to broker peace in Afghanistan. I think everything that he does in a place like Afghanistan is to frustrate Western policy, to make everything that the U.S. and our allies do just that much more difficult. So we have less time, less energy, less focus on places like the Baltics or Central and Eastern Europe. I think Putin sees all of these things as being interconnected. Afghanistan, Ukraine, South Caucasus, Syria, the Baltics, the Arctic. And when he goes to the Afghan poker table, he brings us chips from the Ukraine poker table. He brings it from the Syria poker table, and he connects them, whereas we don't do this. We see these as isolated events. And, you know, at the end of the day, Russia is viewed with a lot of skepticism in the region, has a lot of historical baggage to carry. So I don't think they'll be viewed as an honest broker. Now, on the point the gentleman made here towards the front in the middle about President Trump's focus on war, stress on war, when we're all talking about a diplomatic solution, I didn't quite see it that way. I mean, if he would have announced, some crazy policy about, we're redeploying 140,000 troops, we're taking over combat operations because clearly the Afghans can't do it themselves, blah, 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 that would be a focus on war. But as I said, we are sending more trainers, advisors to help the Afghan security forces improve and maintain their capabilities. And I think this is, as I said in the beginning, responsible, reasonable, and realistic. On the point about the gentleman, the final, yes, what was the main your question again in a nutshell? Pakistan. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I can't read my own handwriting. Now, I would just say this: it was great that President Trump said this, but we heard it from Obama and we heard it from Bush. So it remains to be seen if we can finally find the buttons to push and the levers to pull on Pakistan to get them to change their course.
Go ahead.
On the Imran Khan issue, I just want to make sure I heard it right. He was offering himself as a potential facilitator?
Yeah, actually in response to a question.
Okay.
It was his, thank you. It was his idea
Right.
that you need a credible person
Right.
who has the proper connections and people listen to him.
Sure.
So it was indirectly
Okay.
an offer, but not a
So
direct
I think what you'll see in the next year or so is a lot more Pakistani politicians talking about Afghanistan and India in such ways because they have an election coming up, and so they need to have platforms from which to engage on these issues. And so I think that was an opportunity for him to kind of showcase some of those ideas. I don't think he would be the choice for anybody to be part of any conversation, except for the fact that his party does run that government in the province where there are relationships with these groups. And so I do think that there's an opportunity to collect information from that vantage point. But I think the bigger problem with the issue of negotiations is obviously there's lots of actors with different interests and a lot of countries involved, but there is no actual interlocutor for all parties. The management of the process is really difficult. It's not just who sits around the table, but it's who manages this process and who facilitates it, and who is somebody that can talk to everyone. We never really got to that question in the Obama administration because we were so busy socializing everyone inside the U.S. government on just talking to the Taliban. That was what we spent our time doing. And I think if we were to, like good foreign policy, you build upon what your predecessors did and you refine it and tweak it. And I think now that we've socialized that concept, I think more attention needs to be paid on not just the countries involved, but the actual mechanisms of these negotiations. Like, do you need an envoy? Do you need one person? Do you need a kind of an independent group? That sort of thing. I hope they would be answering those kinds of questions.
Yeah, good strategy requires three basic elements. What are you trying to achieve? How exactly you're going to achieve that? And what are the resources needed to do it? Those were largely absent, especially the how, in President Trump's speech. And this is a persistent problem with American strategy. We don't really do the how. So we'll have some aims, we'll add some stuff, but we really don't think through the how. And we've got to do much better. I think the United States government owes the American people and the people they're putting in harm's way much better. In terms of who can facilitate a peace process, I think Shamila's right. It's got to be somebody not involved in the conflict. And so, because this is so complicated, at the international, the Afghan, Pakistan, and the national level, you've got to have the right architecture, and you've got to have a facilitator or a set of facilitators, managers that are that are not tied to the conflict or seen to be too close to one side or another. So you've got some countries who have a body of expert knowledge and a track record of being able to do this well. You've got some countries not involved in this current conflict who are going through similar peace processes now that could probably help facilitate this. And so if your strategy is to bring this to a negotiated outcome, then a third-party facilitator and who that might be or what set of entities that might be, becomes something very serious to discuss. In terms of Pakistan, how do you win over Pakistan? I don't think you do. I mean, at the end of the day, Pakistan fears that India is going to use Afghanistan as a platform, as a launching pad to dismantle the Pakistani state. And we can lecture them not to think that way. We can tell them it's crazy for them to think that way, but that's the way the national security establishment thinks. And so in some ways you got to start from there, and you've got to look at what sort of outcomes or what sort of processes leading to outcomes that would address this sort of central fear on the part of the Pakistani national security establishment. And for the past 16 years, the United States has demonstrated that it lacks sufficiently compelling carrots or sticks to compel Pakistan to change its mind and go to war against the Afghan Taliban.
And that's a problem. Let's take a few more questions. We'll come down here with Arnie, and then we'll go on the other side after that.
My name's Arnold Zeitlin, and I covered Pakistan for the Associated Press during its golden era at the end of 1969 to early 70s before the Dowd coup. I also believe that the American military presence in Afghanistan is a major obstacle to a resolution of the war. But aside from that, I also covered civil wars in Pakistan, Nigeria, and the Philippines, and none of them ended with a settlement. They ended because they lost. One side lost. And that's true of World War II, it's true of Vietnam, it's true of Kuwait. You can go on and on and on. But the question I want to ask is, I haven't heard anyone talk about China as a facilitator and certainly a country that has an economic interest in the region that is greater than the interests of the United States.
And last question, Alex. Yep.
Hi, Alex Stark. I'm a PhD candidate at Georgetown University. My question is about host nation politics and political institutions. So you have this sort of weird situation, kind of extra constitutional, where you have a president and a CEO. The outcome of the past elections probably raises concerns about what future elections will look like, along with the issues that have already been raised about corruption and lack of governance and so forth. So my question is, what does the Trump strategy say, if anything, about sort of focusing on the domestic politics of Afghanistan and making sure that they're functioning? And is it possible to achieve the U.S. objectives in Afghanistan without such a focus?
Those are two good questions. If we could have each of you try to be pithy in your response. The question of China and this question of domestic politics in Afghanistan.
Could I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm really glad that you brought up these facts of, wars also end when one side loses, and I think sometimes we overlook this with our background as policymakers, and kind of, you want to win, and I think the fact that we had so many military personnel at some point, and we devoted kind of everything that we could have to convincing the Pakistanis or making it right in Afghanistan, and we're still here, is very humbling if you think about it. And you need to humble yourself, and it's hard to accept that you failed. And I think that if we can start a conversation from that point, we might actually be able to become more constructive about it with each other. And I think that's where on the American side, the diplomats and the military folks used to fight a lot about. And when the diplomats would say political settlement, I think the military side would hear failure. So those are some internal issues that definitely need to be sorted out. On China, really quick, I think China has made some interesting transformations in its role in the region in terms of its focus on terrorism and security issues in Pakistan. I think that's an opportunity for anyone who's worried about or concerned about the stability in the region. And I think there's more to come there. I don't know that China as a facilitator would be the best option given its relationship with India and the nature of that. But I do think that China is one of those countries that has a seat at the table.
Chris or Luke? You want
Sure. So my Afghan friends used to joke with me about, as the 2016 election was heating up, that maybe the Afghans should step in and create a national unity government in America between Trump and Clinton. And how do we feel about that?
God.
quite a thought.
Let that sink in a bit.
I'd move to Kabul,
So, I mean, can the United States achieve its aims without, if the Afghan government is unable to sort of end corruption and the sort of kleptocratic behavior that evolved really since probably 2006? I think so, because the corruption issue is going to take a long time, to deal with, and it's probably going to, or it may require a political settlement in Afghanistan for the Afghans to be able to really chart a way forward to addressing it. I mean, the bottom line, American aims, as both Luke and Shamila pointed out, is Afghanistan's not a launching pad for 9/11 scale attacks, and isn't a place where regional instability is being fomented. I mean, both of those can be achieved without ending the corruption challenges. However, through some sort of peace process. However, if the better the Afghan government addresses, these challenges with corruption and these challenges with winning the support of the people, and being able to win the support of people particularly in Taliban-controlled and contested areas, the greater leverage it has in any sort of peace process. And ideally, our strategy should both be intentionally advancing, I think, the idea of or a peace process, and at the same time helping the Afghan government achieve the maximum amount of leverage in that process. And quite frankly, when you look at people like the ambassador, when you look at people like President Ghani, and so many other people who are now, serving in in junior levels of the Afghan government, and they're going to get more senior, there is incredible hope for the future. But it's just going to be very, very hard to get there from here. And the absence of a U.S. strategy is going to make that even harder.
Go ahead.
Yeah, to conclude on that note, I do agree it's a generational struggle, and it's going to be the younger Afghans moving up that I think we're going to bring the greatest amount of reform. But the Afghans are a very proud people, very rich, diverse history, and Americans don't need to tell Afghans how to govern themselves. In many ways, some of the Western ideas placed into the Constitution during Bonn has created many of the problems we face today. Single non-transferable voting, for example, for a country that has very diverse ethnic groups and tribes and multi-member constituents. It just created a lot of havoc, in my opinion. A country that is not used to very strong centralized government, having the head of the government appoint provincial governors, for example. So there are things that we tried. We probably didn't do very well. We're living with the consequences, where the Afghans are living with the consequences. And then when they get to this curious situation like we saw with the last presidential election, there are people who are saying, oh, look at it, it's extra constitutional, it's this and that. The Afghans have made a mess of it, and we're not doing anything to help them. Well, they've made the best of a difficult situation, and they found a way to muddle through. So I don't think it's the role of the U.S. to hold the Afghans' hand on fighting corruption, bringing democracy, this sort of thing. The Afghans are going to find an Afghan way to do this, and they're more than capable of doing so. On the point the gentleman made in the front about, I think China takes a pragmatic view of Afghanistan as well. I think they see it mainly through One Belt, One Road eyes and through economic possibilities. There is a slight concern about fundamentalism, among the Uyghur population that has had connections to some of the insurgent groups in Afghanistan, but I don't think that's a main driver of Chinese policy in the region. And I have to say, I don't agree with your idea, again, that it's like victory or defeat. I think, as I said in my opening remarks, that's too black and white for a place like Afghanistan, and the end state is going to be something that's in between that, especially because it is an insurgency and not a civil war or a sort of state-on-state conflict, as we've had. And then I'll conclude by saying, throwing perhaps a provocative statement out there about India. Maybe we're hugging India too closely on this. Maybe some of the activities India is doing in Afghanistan aren't all benign. Yes, they're dumping a lot of money in reconstruction. They're building a lot of roads. And we should be grateful for that, but sometimes these roads are designed to divert trade away from Pakistan to Iranian ports, and it's not shocking that it doesn't take a leap of faith to see how Pakistan could see some of these activities by India in Afghanistan as being provocative or malign.
No, that's very true. That's a good point. Unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap up. I think the big takeaway here, and we just heard this underscored just now, is the time factor. I mean, there are not going to be instant achievements. There are no silver bullets. There are no magic remedies for Afghanistan. We really have to take a longer view in terms of in terms of U.S. policy. And in some of the circles I inhabit, I'm hearing in these discussions about Afghanistan, I'm hearing the analogy of Colombia a lot. not to overstate the similarities between Colombia and Afghanistan, but the insurgency in Colombia took, 60, 70 years to be negotiated to an end. So the fact that you're starting to hear analogies like that really suggests the need to, think about the long view. So I wanted to thank Ambassador Mohib not only for your remarks, but also for staying with us for the duration of the event. We really appreciate it. It's great to have you here. I wanted to thank all three panelists. I really appreciate your comments and your remarks, and thank all of you as well. So if we can have a round of applause for everyone. Thank you.